Good morning. I'm Deb Sullivan, trainer from the Office of Academic Affairs, and I want to welcome you to Primetime at the library. Primetime is a collaboration between Friends of the Library and Academic Affairs and a number of other offices. And what we want to do during these times is celebrate learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. Next, on Thursday, Chris Garrett and Sam Mulberry and the students that participated in their interim trip on World War I are going to be talking about their experience. So we encourage you to come back and join them to learn about that exciting opportunity. And today we welcome Joel Ward of the Communication Studies Department, and he's going to speak to us about authority and personality, dynamics, and dialogue. Thanks, Joel.
Good morning. Oh, it's loud. Like Deb said, my name is Joel Ward, and I'm a temporary faculty in the Communication Studies Department. And this work that I'm going to kind of be showing to you today is out of my dissertation work that I'm finishing at the university. So that's who I am. And what I've been primarily interested in when I entered the field of communication studies, because it's a very broad field, and it's dominated by a lot of different ideas. And so originally when I was studying in the communication studies field as a master's student and then even as a doctoral student, I was kind of curious where a Christian fits in. Because, you know, there's a lot of talk about diversity and those kinds of things. And where does someone who kind of has a certainty about the way life is lived and the way it should be practiced fit into kind of an environment in which inclusivity and diversity is something that's kind of preferred and is a dominant narrative. So I was very interested in how a Christian can provide or contribute to communication studies. And I had to overcome some of my original fears about that. But one of the things that kind of intrigued me was a particular problem in communication studies, which is which I'll call the power paradigm, which is how is it that people communicate to each other in situations of power differential, right? And that's a big concern of a lot of communication researchers. How do you create an egalitarian context in which everyone's voice is heard? Right? Because the presumption is that when everyone's talking, then better decisions are made and other kinds of things. But the problem with the power paradigm that I found was that you have this other person that you're talking to, and you have yourself, right? But then they're contrary to each other, right? So if one person has power, then the other one is subjected to that power. And the person that has power is necessarily the person who is subjecting them, right? And it's kind of difficult to work out how is that power mediated, right? And some people say, well, it's context. Some people say it's particular practices, those kinds of things. But those things have to be agreed upon by both people before that's really going to be the mediating effect, right? Otherwise, you end up in situations where someone has the power and the other person doesn't have the power, and we all know circumstances in which that happens. And people disagree about ways to mediate that power. So that's kind of one of the primary paradigms that I was thinking about. I was thinking, okay, I can contribute to this, and primarily because I think, well, as a Christian, Christ in our lives mediates that power, right? So I have power to speak into your life and tell you things about yourself and tell you things about the circumstances that we live in. And one of the things that keeps my own personal pride and my assertiveness and ambitions at bay is my relationship with Jesus Christ as a Christian. Okay? Well, that makes sense as Christians, but how am I going to take that outside of the sphere of Christian intercourse or communication and say, this is actually a valid truth for people beyond that sphere, that this can teach us something about communication in general that isn't specific to Christian communities. How do I do that? So enter Mikhail Bakhtin. He's a Russian philologist or philosopher, I guess you would say. Very interested in language and writing during the Stalinist period in Soviet Russia. So he started writing early in the 1920s and then was exiled because of some of his ideas, which were supposedly contrary to Marxism. And then kind of had an intellectual revival, or was discovered by intellectuals in Moscow around their late 60s, and kind of had some of his works published then, and the early 70s, and he died in 1972. But was able, but those students that discovered him were able to publish a lot of his work either during that time or posthumously. And it's been most recently translated into English into the late 80s, or mid to late 80s and then the early 90s, where it was adopted into English studies in North America and then slowly into communication studies. So the thing that Mikhail Bakhtin says is that is important for this idea of power and this problem of power is he says that the relationship with Christ is kind of a various one, right? We can't say that this is the way it should do it. And he says it's kind of a problem with philosophy and theology because in philosophy and theology we want to kind of create these vivid pictures of what actually happens. And he says, well, that's not really the case because as soon as you create a theory for something, then you've abstracted it out of experience. And living with Christ and being in communication and relationship with Christ is a variable experience. Everybody's relationship with Christ is different. So how can we really think about this problem of communication and power paradigm and all those things in a way that's forgiving enough so that it's transferable to multiple kinds of relationships and experiences? And so he says, well, we can't really do it in philosophy or theology. What we need to do is we need to do it in art and the aesthetic. Because art is very forgiving, right? The aesthetic sphere is quite merciful. Many people enter into it. Some people are quite angry about kinds of art that are produced. But many things get added to the artistic world, whether we consider them art or not. It's a very broad sphere. It isn't very exclusive, actually. And he says, in the novel, what we find is a way to talk about this kind of relationship, the relationship that we have between people with this kind of power problem, without kind of saying this is the way it is actually happening, right? We can look at it and we can see what's happening, and we can learn some things from looking at novels. And of course, he believes that Dostoevsky is one of the best authors in the way that he portrays his characters in the novel as creating kind of this image of life and the way people interact. And he says the primary dynamic then that you need to think about in the novel is how does a hero, right, how does an author in a novel create heroes or heroines within a novel that are free to interact with each other? That you don't just kind of create this world in which everybody interacts based on particular traits or characteristics, and there isn't kind of this freedom, or shall we say, in man's relationship to God, free will, right? How does that happen? And the author's relationship to the hero is a good way to think about that, because an author supposedly knows exactly what's going to happen in an entire novel, and yet the best novels are ones in which we can step into relationship with the characters and watch them interact without the narrator kind of taking control of the situation, which is a nice way to think about life with God, right? So he says we need to look at the author-hero dynamic and kind of understand what's going on there, right? He says what we need to do is find out how this kind of relationship is worked out principally before we can think about it in a particular way, right? How it happens in our lives. What is the principal dynamic that's working in this relationship between a supreme authority and the heroes that are living and working together with each other? So either characters in a novel or people in the world in their relationship with God. And so he says the most vivid picture of whole human personalities does not come from plot line, destiny, or context in a study of the novel, right? So there's different kinds of novels, and some of them all drive the characters forward with a particular crisis or an adventure or context or antagonist, protagonist. And he says, in fact, the best picture that we get in the novel of how people interact with each other really in life is the interaction of human consciousnesses in language. And so he says that Dostoevsky does a really nice job of taking people out of this kind of first this happened, then that happened, this and happened, kind of a historical linear view of life, and kind of just looks at what happens when people talk to each other, and grapples with real human problems like guilt and anxiety, and the internal turmoil of people's consciousness. And what he basically discovers then is that personalities, these personalities interacting with each other, are largely made up of words. My words come from me, and they penetrate you, and your words come from you, and they penetrate me. And it's in that dynamic that our personhood is differentiated. Right? Who I am, who you are, those kinds of things happen when words are exchanged. And he says, so the word is kind of the material of yourself. It's the material of the soul. And where those words come from are kind of important for how personhood is emergent or actualized, or where you actually discover self-consciousness, right? It's the words of the people outside of you that have a distinct authority, right, in relationship to you, is where your consciousness emerges from. And so he wants to talk about this in the novel, obviously, because as soon as you move into psychology, he says even then you start modeling how this happens in a general sense. And he says it's a particular relationship, and it's happening variously in time, it's happening variously in relationship, and we can't just say, oh, this is how it happens, now go and do that. Because he says then you create these paradigms that are quite static, and people use these static paradigms to try to relate to people, and you create a lot of misunderstanding. So he's looking at a very merciful model of understanding how it is that people interact with each other and how people can interact with authority. And in that interaction also have their voice, right, or their actual personality emerge as unique and distinct. Okay. So in his understanding of the novel, he articulates that relationship, but in some of his previous or philosophical works, more philosophical works, which is where my doctoral research is, he is looking at how it is, and he's using this author-hero relationship as paradigmatic. He's looking at how is it that authors relate to their heroes. Right? Okay. What kind of context does this create for the emergence of unique personalities, right? And he says, well, but more importantly, can we think about it as how do authors relate to heroes, right? Not as an author with all these heroes going on, but actually in the way that I speak to people, I'm actually serving as an author of their life, just as they also serve as an author of my life. And so I'm simultaneously an author and a hero, right? And that there's multiple authors in my life, right? And in my life there's multiple heroes, right? And he says, well, primarily this context is a dialogic context, right? It's all mediated in words. Okay. But he says dialogue, and even in communication studies, dialogue is said, well, dialogue is the way we need to work this out. It creates a context in which people can talk to each other in an egalitarian way, and one's voice is not dominant over another, and there's kind of this plane in which people can experience each other's perspective without, one person feeling dominated and the other person feeling, or feeling dominant and the other person feeling subjected. Right? But he says, actually, that still just kind of is a paradigm. You say, oh, well, we'll just use dialogue. But that just is putting too much emphasis on a particular context that still needs to be agreed upon by the people involved. And so he says, more importantly, we need to think about the word as eternal, right? All around us, in us, and through us. Okay? And it's not necessarily a context that kind of mediates this relationship, but it is a word that descends from outside, a word that descends from outside of our world, right? That is absolutely merciful, and that confirms both the position of the author and the hero simultaneously, with a cherishing contemplation, right, that mediates this relationship. And his ideal paradigm, right, is Christ. But Christ is an interesting character in this relationship, right, because he is both a supreme authority, absolute authority, and yet an absolutely merciful companion. And so as Christians we say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, this makes sense. This is nothing new. He's, okay, Christ is the perfect ideal. I want to imitate Christ. But what he also becomes is this synthesis of both the ideal way that people should talk to each other and author, speak into each other's lives, just as Christ did to the people he interacted with, but also fully material. He's among us now as a concrete person in history, in his own body, but also in the ideal in which he creates a paradigm that everybody can utilize in their distinct relationships. Okay? And what we see in the eternal Word as Christ, right, is a great power, a significant power to create new life, right? Changing completely the purpose and tone of human interactivity, right? So not a communicative context that creates this dynamic where power becomes not a threatening thing, right, but actually a creative thing. And so Christ becomes a creative presence, right, that re-intones the words that we use with people, okay, to make them creative and to even use theological terminology like resurrect that person from who they are now to a new person who they can become. Okay. So we say, okay, well, that's nice. That works for Christians pretty well, but people don't necessarily think about Christ all that much if they're not a Christian. But it does introduce this interesting dynamic, which is not that there's kind of an ideology that people use to kind of talk out of, even though they do, but that primarily what people appeal to when they're in this kind of situation where there's a power dynamic and they're not really sure how to mediate that, is that they appeal to an idea or another person, a personified ideal in their life that is the person that they appeal to, that they think will mediate this relationship. And then we wonder why most people turn to the judicial system to sort out idiosyncratic problems they have with their neighbor. Okay? Because the judge is a personification of justice, purportedly. So he says, this is the way the real world is, okay? But what it shows us is that in any instance in which I want to mediate this relationship between myself and another person, I make an appeal to a person that I think is absolutely merciful towards me and will see my perspective. The only problem is that when it's not Christ, then it's quite different for either person. So what we realize then is that authority, our understanding of authority, has a distinct notion, becomes very influential in our understanding of personhood, which I think is pretty important because we talk about interpersonal communication. But you need to know who and what you're talking to in interpersonal communication, right? What I think I'm speaking to, if it's really a person who has needs and desires and problems like me, that changes the way that I speak to them, or if they're a person, or maybe they're just a right-wing politician. Right? So what kind of person I'm talking to, right? And my understanding of how authority relates to them changes a tone, right? So what we get is a paradigm. Maybe I shouldn't use a paradigm, but what we get is a scenario in which, in the Christian model, Christ is both author and hero, right? And we also, as we relate to other people, are authors and heroes of other people's lives and in other people's lives. Right? And then I think of songs like "You're My Hero" and stuff like "You're the Wind Beneath My Wings" and stuff like that. You see that articulated in popular discourse all the time. People identify heroes, right, in their lives that operate idealistically of who they want to become, right? And that person serves as an authority in their life, right? Which intones then the rest of their communication, so to speak. So authority then becomes something quite different. It's not kind of this only outside thing that just relates to me as an object, but authority is both a thing that is outside, that supposedly transcends the particularity of human interaction, but at the same time is personal and close to me. And that the things that have most authority in our lives or are most influential in the way that we speak to people are the ones that are closest to us, the ones who speak words that penetrate us most deeply. So the question is what is the authority? Right? If it's not Christ, then the kind of reflective question one must ask is, in my life, in my discourse, who serves as an authority, as a resonant with the intonation of my own words, right, that I appeal to most often when I am speaking to other people? And some people use themselves. Right? Who is it? Not what is it, because even if it's an ideology, like dialogic communication, okay, that dialogic communication is still a person that I think is standing next to me as my advocate. Right? And I supposedly interact with dialogic communication quite interpersonally as I speak to another person. And my form of dialogic communication as a person will be my authority when I speak to that person. And they might think, oh yeah, dialogic communication, and have a totally different version of it. So the interesting thing is, depending on what authority, right, you choose, it will have a distinct impact, right, on the tone of your words as you speak to people. A distinct one. Right. Again, not a lot of new thoughts here, but kind of a reorientation as far as how to understand this as it's understood in the Christian life. So the juxtaposition between the author and hero and how they interact with each other is distinctly tied to how they view this authority, right? And what kind of authority they think it is. And depending on that authority or difference in opinion about what is authoritative in a particular conversation or communicative context, the interaction can either be quite positive and beneficial for both people, affirmed in their own position, and defined unique and valuable in their own personhood, or can be devaluing at the same time, right? So, what are some of the things that Bakhtin has taught me in kind of his formulation of understanding how people communicate with each other in language, and how understanding Christ as a constantly present person in human discourse serves as an ideal paradigm for how it is that we should think about the way that conversation works itself out, specifically in relationship to authority and our own sense of personhood or personality. So the first one is that the person or personification of authority to which you most often appeal will greatly determine the tone of your discourse. And so sometimes, I find myself appealing to the authority of my education, which may or may not be effective in the way that I communicate to the people in front of me. Right? 2, less concern for one's self, which I don't have control over, because where do the words that are myself come from? From the outside. even the words that I speak myself are on the outside of me, not on the inside of me. Less concern for oneself will result in more constructive, creative, and less defensive, destructive patterns of communication. Or, more simply put, you can't defend yourself because it's not yours. That's kind of hard for me to admit, right? But again, realize that Bakhtin is thinking about a paradigm in which there is a supreme authority who really does govern who you are. And he's saying that the image of that paradigm is in every person. And that we actually do have the power to take someone's soul, right, and consume it. Like some people have called it interpersonal colonization. Right? I do have the power to make you not a human, but an animal. Right? And animals, that's up for debate, I guess, whether they have souls or not. It's happened in history. We've seen it happen. Okay. And then the third one, right, is that the voice with the most authority in a life will have a determining impact on one's potential for achieving whole and meaningful personhood. And so, a Christian, this gives me great hope, because as I realize that Christ is the ultimate and absolute authority in my life, what does he ask me to do? Become this all-powerful person who then dominates other people? No. His first request is that I look outside of myself and see how I can support and embellish and encourage and construct and creatively create an environment around me that allows people to emerge as unique, freely acting individuals. My role as an author, then, with the authority that I have through the power of the eternal word, right, is to create a scenario in which the people that live around me and the people that live within the sphere of my discourse, right, are able to interact with each other, right, in a most merciful and gracious way. Okay. But as far as it's related to communication studies, right, I think this is kind of a very interesting proposition, because then, depending on what person you appeal to primarily as an authority, which is not necessarily authoritative in the sense that we think about it, but the person that most frequently speaks into you, the person whose words are most easily recalled to mind, the person who appears before you as a person who not only passes good judgment, but gives good advice and supports you and confirms you and loves you no matter what. That is the person, or that person will serve as that primary authority. And depending on what kind of person that is, right, will have a distinct impact on what kind of person you can become or be. Thank you. Any questions or comments are welcome.
In the author hero,
Yes.
it seemed like it slipped a couple times between hero as protagonist, character acting in the scenario, and hero, someone who does heroic acts.
Okay.
So,
You want me to elaborate on that
Yes.
a little bit? So, not in this one here, but the next one. Oh, so here. Oops. Sorry. So your question is how does the hero serve as someone whose life is kind of constructed by an author, but then also becomes someone who is heroic to someone?
yes, it felt like it slipped a couple, like you kind of slipped between those two.
Slip between those two, right?
And
Yeah.
just wanted some clarification. Is it really both, or is it one or the other?
It's actually both, because you can be both an author and a hero at the same time. And that's what's interesting, is that Christ, as the ideal person, right, but also the most material person, right, because he's both, right, shows us, how that happens, right. So he is both the author and creator of creation, right, but then he is also a participant in it as a person that we can interact with, right. And so as we speak, we create worlds that people can inhabit, right. And so some people talk about this as organizational culture, right? Some people are very influential in creating a particular organizational culture that either lets people speak freely or not freely, right? But at the same time, right, you're involved in the organizational culture, right? And you can be a person who advocates for that culture, and you can be heroic, right, to people within that culture as far as embodying that discourse or that articulation of it. Does that make sense?
We need to ponder that.
Yeah, it's taken me quite a few more words to actually do the whole thing. And this is actually my first attempt to fully articulate it in presentational form. But yeah, it is an interesting dynamic to try to consider, because that's what Christ is, right? He is absolute justice and authority, love, mercy, and grace, embodied, incarnate, right, in a person. And so he isn't just the author of the story, he's also the hero of the story.
And hero in both senses.
Yes, of course, because he becomes then that which we want to emulate and imitate. Yes, Bill.
So, in the Christian world,
Yep.
those of us who recognize Christ, who read Scripture, who see his story in this, I see a lot of times a perception of who Christ is, of power and judgment and harshness and repression. There are those who really present that authority in a very negative and controlling kind of way. And I see it as sometimes being used to create monologue rather than dialogue. I want to speak to that.
Well, Bakhtin says something very interesting, which he says that even monologic discourse is primarily dialogic. It's just a diminished form
Say
of
that
it.
again.
He says
A
even
diminished form.
diminished form of dialogue, because in any circumstance, say, I am diminishing you by being monologic in my discourse. There is a third person advocate there with me that justifies my discourse. And so there's always a third participant, which he considers to be one of the basic forms of dialogue. Right? And so in that circumstance, what would be interesting to note is when we have these kind of interpersonal notions of who Christ is, right? But you kind of see that coming out in popular discourse when people say, what would Jesus do? Right? That kind of thing. Well, I think the original intention, even though that kind of becomes commodified and cliched, so it no longer has the effect, right? Which is that, do you speak as though Christ were standing here watching you have that conversation? Or would you say the same things to him? Because he's decided to come down and stand next to you, as if you could look him in the face and say these things. Right? A God that you can look in the face. Right? Then, right, the judgment that you're passing, right, is immediately related to, right, your understanding of the role Christ has in your life. And so I would say that most people who think of Christ as the establishing their authority and ability to pass judgment on other people probably aren't holding him very close. And that's an experiential thing. That's not a cognitive thing, right? That's a Christ's Spirit lives here in and through us. How much of that body do I feel?
So it's a misperception of
Yeah.
who is standing next to me.
Right.
A lot of misperception.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I think the model is quite somewhat attractive, but also difficult to grapple with, because it remains quite flexible in practice. It's not something that you can say, oh, well, you're not being dialogic with me. And the person says, well, yes, I am, according to such and such a model. Okay.
And
I say, well, I'm not using his model, I'm using his model.
Yeah.
And then you have to kind of say, well, yeah, it's difficult, right? And the way that Christ responded in different interpersonal situations often baffles us, right? It's baffling. But I think that should compel us to a more serious inquiry about how it is that we relate to him, so that in our relationship with others, that kind of baffling speak, right, becomes a part of our discourse, in which we seem to do something that's totally contrary to the character of a Christian person. But that's because we want to be absolutely merciful, right, to the people in front of us. Okay. Rita.
Okay. I can understand using Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Solzhenitsyn, some of the other authors where this kind of a model. But I tell you something, Joel, I've read some books in the past year, just to while away a little time that I should have been using reading papers, that when I could not see fitting those into this model.
Definitely not, yeah. And that's why he spends all of his time on Dostoevsky. He says, this is not characteristic of the novel genre necessarily.
Okay.
So you'll have diminished forms, right? But then we're back to what Phil's talking about. I have a diminished understanding of what it means to be an author in someone's life. And so we know authors that have a diminished understanding of what an author is supposed to do, and their books are terrible. Right? And he says one of the reasons why Dostoevsky's stories are so compelling is because it's like watching life happen, but it's like watching the light happen, right? Because he's been able to extract himself, right? And he talks it's kind of like this loving distance in which God steps away from the action, right? So that people, right, steps away to a distance, right, to which people can interact, right? So Christ doesn't stand between us and other people, right, but beside us, definitely. And so, you know, it's actually kind of an intuitive thing when you read a good novel, right? The characters interacting with each other is what's compelling about the story, not the fact that they crossed the river and mounted the mountain, and, you know, and that's why most crime shows now, right, are really not about solving crime. They're all about the interactions of the characters as they solve the crime, because that's what's compelling, right? Not that a person has been killed and now they found the killer, which is, you know, it's the same formula over and over and over again. Yeah. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, when you bring the self into it, sorry, I came in, but because we know, like with self-identity, that we all have so many different self-identities, so many. When I bring that into a dialogue, it's problematic, because what identity am I bringing? How do you know what identity I'm bringing? And how does that become a
Right, and he would say that's why the self is primarily a divided self. And so how do you know which one you are? Right? I mean, you have all these people who are influencing who you are. Which one are you? And he's saying that's the problem, right? That there isn't kind of like these distinct, discrete cells that interact with each other. We're all a part, you know, we're all intermingled through our use of language, because that's the primary material of who we are. And so his question is, who operates as an authority in that discourse that mediates, right, and manages all of those other selves that are kind of
But wouldn't that depend on what self I'm taking on?
Well, he would say you don't have control necessarily in that way. You can't say, today I'm this person, tomorrow this person.
But when I take on a certain role, like if I take on a mother, I'm one person. I take on a teaching, I'm another person. A wife, I'm another. That's different, all my different identities. So depending on what I take on, depends how Christ speaks through me, in a sense. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
My role as a mother.
But he would say, but role and who you are as a person are not the same thing,
But
right?
that's part of your identity. It's part of your self-identity.
Right. But who you are as a mother and how you enact that will be primarily who you appeal to as an authority and what a mother should do.
I just finished reading a book by Louise Penny,
Okay.
a Canadian writer. I cannot remember the name of the book. But the main character, when I finished the book, it was a mystery of all things. When I finished the book, I said to myself, the main character in that book is Christ. And that shook me up, because it was like, Lena, what are you saying? But that's the way we can portray that person. And when you started thinking about that, that book is very close to me still. It resonates with what you're saying, because he was in all of these different, he was solving a murder. He was in all of these different situations with all of these people, and his persona was, where do I want to be? Tight, clear.
Illuminating, yeah.
Illuminating.
Yeah.
Every time he stepped into a room with another person. And since that, when I prayed, I thought, why is it? Maybe it is because I'm a communication. And I resonate with what Nancy's saying. Rather than becoming more like Jesus.
Well-
Which seems so simplistic.
Well, and I want to get back to Nancy's question, because I think it's a really good one that I probably should address more explicitly. And one of the reasons being is that I think in sometimes communication studies, right, will say, well, you serve all these different roles. You should behave differently in all of the circumstances. Well, definitely, right? But what unifies your behavior in all of those activities, right? What makes you a whole person in each one of those distinct roles? And it's not like you use part of your person over here and part of your person over here. You take the whole Nancy with you when you're a mom, right? Your whole body's there, right? Yeah, which is what people interact with, right? So, and so what is, and that's kind of why he's asking the question, what authority is personified that stabilizes, right, all of those different roles and interactions that we have in a daily life. Right? And is there one? And if there isn't one, then you will.
I would argue there isn't.
Well, he would say there isn't one if you don't identify the notion that Christ is constantly present with you, right?
Well, no, I would believe Christ would constantly be present with me as a competent communicator, where I take on those different identities, and he has different expectations for me. I would argue he has different expectations for me based on who I'm communicating with.
Right, definitely. But his character doesn't change, right?
No, that's true. But mine persona does.
Right. But if you are too kind of, and they talk about this on code switching, right? They'll talk about code switching, and you move between different cultures or social groups, and you code switch. But if you code switch too much, what do people call you?
Code switch?
Two-faced.
Two-faced, inauthentic, opposer, fake, inauthentic. Okay? And that's what they're asking is this your whole person here? Or are you just giving us part of you?
Or are you a really competent interpersonal communicator?
No, but if you're a liar, you can be really confident in lying.
Being liar does not have anything to do with code switching.
Sometimes I would say it could be, yes.
It could, but it
Because the question becomes, when you code switch, are you diminishing parts of your character, right, of the person that you are in order, right, to appear or perform rather than actually be?
But I'm changing in order to relate, in order to witness at a level that is being understood in that culture or subculture.
Right.
So therefore, code switching isn't deceptive. It's a tool that God gives you to be able to minister until you get and express love, in my mind, to the point where you,
Right, but
you bring them to
what stabilizes all of those different scenarios and personalities that you embody in different circumstances, right?
Yeah.
And so they actually talk about this in, I've been looking for this article, I read it once and I lost it. They have a term for it, but it's basically people who, you know, become CEOs of companies and stuff like that, and so their days are filled with code switching and stuff like that. And actually, it's like they flatten out.
Right.
And they struggle with that because they don't know who they are, because they're always performing, they're not actually being. Right?
Yep.
And so, and that's the question, right? If you think of relating to people in code switching as primarily performative activity, Bakhtin might say, well, you're taking an ideal form of what you think needs to be that person in that circumstance. And you're not actually entering that. You're not incarnating, right? What, with your body, the person that is in front of that other person communicating, right? And I can see, I don't know that, you know, Christ is the incarnation of truth and love.
Right.
Right? And those are aspects of his being that are never separate from him when he relates to anyone.
Right.
And so there might be aspects of you in any one of the situations that people would say, that's Nancy. Right? And that doesn't mean that you can't change the way you talk to someone so that you can better relate to them. But it does mean that at a certain point, when you've stepped outside of yourself to put on a performative activity, right, then are you still who you are?
But even Christ would do that.
You're talking about authenticity.
Because I would say that this ties in with what Lita would talk about, this illuminating type, wherever she went. When you said, Lita, I saw Jesus in all of these, in that book you read.
And he was the man,
Yeah,
the main character
yeah.
was who he was.
Mhm.
Was not changing and being something here, changing.
Like
being
some
something.
detectives do in
That's
crime
right.
novels. They're
Which made it
deceptive and
very-
tell lies. And,
Yes, yes.
I'm going to close the official part of this and encourage this dialogue.
Great.
Keep going.
Thank you for your questions,
Thank you very much,
Nancy.
Joel.